Okay, this video is called The New Nations, right? So colonialism is still all around the world, and European countries are mainly in control of all the other countries in the world. That's basically how it's working, right? Remember, after World War II, the United Nations was created to maintain peace and security amongst all the countries in the world. They didn't want another world war, and they were supposed to develop friendly relationships among those countries. Also, the United Nations, otherwise known as the UN, also did a lot of humanitarian work and a lot of like civil rights work. So they supported humans and humanity around the world. There's also been a growing sense of nationalism, right? All throughout the world after World War II, all these countries believe in themselves and they want to be their own country. And nationalism, remember, we talked about is pride in one's country. All right, so now we've got the India independence. That's one of the first India new nations we're going to talk about. They gained their independence in 1947, and India was this prized possession of Britain, right? And they had been a British colony since 1847. They were very diverse. Two main religions, you had Hindus and Muslims in India. And in 1885, the Indian National Congress came together to fight for the people of India's rights against the British, right? Eventually, the INC, with the help of Gandhi's, they were able to work for India's independence, like I said, in 1947. So Gandhi was a British-educated Hindu Indian, right, who came to India to fight for the freedom of India. And he used civil disobedience like hunger strikes, boycotts, marches, and these nonviolent movements to fight for independence, right? He was ultimately assassinated by another Hindu, somebody who was, against what he was standing for, because that person did not want both Hindus and Muslims living in the same country, and they did assassinate Gandhi, but not before he and the INC were able to get India as a new nation. The second one's a little more confusing here, right? So Israel and Palestine, this is an issue we still have today. Diaspora is the dispersion of Jews from Israel, and it dates back all the way to the fall of Constantinople in the 1400s, so when Jews were kind of fleeing the nation of Israel back then. Zionism is the movement to settle Jews back into Israel, and this became really big in the 1900s, especially after World War II. So as a result of those two things, plus the events of World War II with the Holocaust and everything, the UN helped to establish the Israel nation again. So Jews started to move back to Israel. But the problem is, both Jews and Arab Muslims both believed that their country, or that land that they were calling Israel, was home to their original ancestors. And the Muslims refer to that area as Palestine, right? Both of these groups of people are still fighting for control of that territory. There has been a history of violence. The proposed solution is to create two states in that same area, but figuring out who gets what parts of that area has been very confusing and has led to a lot of violence historically there. There's still no solution. My boards. Let me adjust here. There we go. Okay, so now let's talk about Africa, right? So the African colonization and decolonization, most of Africa was colonized by 1945, mostly by European countries, and most of Africa was decolonized by 1985. There should be a parenthesis right there, right? So this resulted in successful countries being created and unsuccessful countries being created. And a lot of the unsuccessful countries were because of civil wars and people fighting for power, and they never really figuring out how to set up a government. And a lot of the African nations at the time were still pretty underdeveloped, and they were considered third world nations. So a lot of these groups, sometimes led by dictators or extreme military groups, vied for power, and this led to a bunch of civil wars and issues all around, like the Rwandan genocide. Hotel Rwanda is the movie made about that. Sudan with the Lost Boys, and then Egypt most recently as they worked to overthrow their government. All right. Then you have South Africa is the one we're going to end on. South Africa obviously is in Africa. It's at the very tip of Africa, hence South Africa. It was controlled by the British until its independence in 1910, but the South Africans remained behind. And the Europeans, remained behind to control the country, and they were extremely racist, right? And so they were white Europeans, and there were black South Africans, and the people in charge were the white people, and they were extremely racist and stayed behind even after independence. In the 1940s, their racial policies or their racial thoughts became policies and practices, and this led to the sharp separation between blacks and whites in South Africa, and we now know that era as the Apartheid. Right? In 1950, the government passed the Population Registration Act, and that classified all South Africans into 3 groups, right? So the black or the Bantu, which is kind of the same group, whites or colored, and this were mixed people of mixed ancestry, right? So the African National Congress fought for the rights of South Africans, for black South Africans, to end the apartheid. But many of those leaders were jailed and put in prison because they were obviously speaking out against the white dominant majority. But it does come to an end, thankfully. In 1962, the UN officially condemned apartheid. And many countries around the world boycotted South Africa. They stopped buying goods from there. They stopped trading with them. It also prevented South Africa from joining the Olympics and the World Cup. And ultimately, things like that started to help. Many of the segregation laws were repealed in the 1980s. In 1990, many of those INC leaders, the political prisoners, were freed, including Nelson Mandela, who was very popular and really the face of the anti-apartheid fight. And in 1992, a new constitution was passed that gave everybody the right to vote in South Africa. And in 1994, Nelson Mandela was elected the first black president of South Africa, and he led a ton of change after that to get South Africa where they are today.